As with the real benefits section, some of these points will have already been covered in other sections, as they relate directly to various topics within those sections. Still, it is better to have the pragmatics of implementation also gathered together in one section for the ease of the reader to reference. As the first pass-through illustrates, and indeed as all crises and the recent pandemic illustrate, the bare removal of money from the system without any real change to the system already demonstrates the plausibility of a moneyless free labor society. History is filled to the brim with examples whereby actions are done without recourse to the whip, the tool of money. Activist actions, volunteering, in some sense philanthropic activities, faith-based actions, and much of the day-to-day labors of the home, the reproductive labors, all occur without money. In times of crisis of whatever sort, moneyed concerns simply put are not of the sort that anyone takes particularly seriously. Moreover, the basic recognition that money is just a tool that has no intrinsic value, and indeed that in terms of monetary value there is exactly nothing that has this intrinsically, is not only critical for understanding and accepting the plausibility of a moneyless free labor society, but it is also critical for understanding how that kind of valuation causes the problems the species generally face in the currents, and oft have been faced in the species' history. To mistake money for the things money measures is among the worst aspects of money's use. If I were to hold that the world is measured via meters, the area so measured would exist sans meters. Money supposedly measures value, but value exists sans the tool of measurement. To think that gathering money together creates wealth is actually as insane as thinking that gathering together meter measuring sticks is creating a great area. Many folks are almost certainly inclined to think that there is something unrealistic about the claims of this piece, the supposed boons of it and the prospects of its implementation. In no small amount these are exactly addressed within the Pragmatics of Implementation section. However, I want to firstly provide folks with a sense of the reality of what is plausible, what is realistic. Massive changes to cultures are not uncommon historically. It is defeatist to hold that something simply cannot be done. There are historical examples of all the claims being made. There are no claims made here that are proposing something that is, therefore, unrealistic. Their realism is manifested via exactly their historical parallels. It can be tempting for folks to hold that the historical parallels themselves, while real, also inform as to why we ought not, as in, there were bads associated with the various relevant historical parallels. However, I think this sort of claim is rather wildly overblown for several reasons. 1. Because we have these historical parallels, we can at least potentially avoid the pitfalls thereof. 2. While there are historical parallels, the species is most definitely not in the same set of circumstances that it used to be in. For all the ills of it all, global colonialism and the various technological wonders the species has at its disposal, all entail a rather dramatically different set of circumstances from those of the relevant historical parallels. Hence, we ought expect the outcomes from these kinds of proposals to be different, rather than the same. 3. In particular, the educational operati and the various social justice gains over the past, let's say 150 years or so have fairly radically shifted the species' basic understanding and living reality. In other words, not only have the circumstances changed, but people themselves have changed. Hence, we ought not expect the same kinds of outcomes. Among the things that the pandemic and the uprisings demonstrated was a capacity and willingness of masses of peoples all around the globe to take action towards specific, laudable ends and aims. Among the central problems therein were that folks had major disagreements remaining as to exactly what sorts of ends and aims the species ought to aim for. While I am definitively holding that this piece and other pieces on amateur philosophy are the proper sorts of aims, perhaps with some fiddling around to be done here and there, the main thrust at the moment is that such also demonstrates the realism of the proposals here. That is, we already did this sort of thing, we've already demonstrated that such is plausible, that such is realistic on the proper scalar that is being proposed here. Industrial Revolution. To quote the poets, the rest is scribbling and bibbling. There is a certain inevitability to the realization of a moneyless free labor society, and a certain sense that when money is simply removed from the existing system, the real labor economy with its connection to the ecologies becomes very apparent. In terms of the inevitability of it, within the current system something akin to the proposal here, with or without money, is inevitable as the economies run up against the various bioregional restrictions and renewal rates of those systems as a reality. In other words, when resources become more valuable than money, people cannot help but devalue money. Such amounts to out-of-control inflation in a moneyed society at any rate. The realization that society is a series of community arrangements becomes apparent. The moneyed system, not on its own but in big part, destroys the environment to the point that actual scarcity of resources becomes the reality. When that happens, it isn't money that is valuable, nor money that addresses the issues, it is war by and large, which is undesirable. A basic understanding of the history of economics reveals that underpinning the theory was a belief that humans simply couldn't exhaust the bioregions. That in essence, the renewal rate of the various systems was far greater than anything humans could overproduce from. Such is clearly not the case. As resources become more scarce, the realities of being forced to work within those constraints will be ever more apparent. The pragmatic choice, as alluded to elsewhere, is simply do we go through a series of catastrophes in order to get to the points more or less laid out in this proposal, or do we avoid those catastrophes and just implement, if not this proposal exactly, something very much akin to it? Noting that the incentives of money, the incentives of wealth, have as a consequence exactly the overproduction of the bioregions. It may be a bit more nuanced than that. There is something to the notion of getting more out of less resource use that is also within the moneyed system. However, that point is not necessarily tied to a moneyed system. See section 12G, Metrics of Involvation, Innovation. The inevitability argument ought to be rather powerful. That is, folks ought to understand that ultimately there isn't really much choice in the matter as to if. There are, however, meaningful and good choices as to when and how a moneyless free labor society is enacted. The argument isn't that people will force the issue either, the argument is that ecologies will force the issue. Moneyed systemizations are simply unsustainable, at the very least as they are currently structured, though the argument here is that all moneyed systemizations carry with them an inherent instability, in that they are decoupled from the ecologies, and a bit more broadly, the real economies, upon which they are predicated. As that instability manifests itself via ecological devastation, the species has to come to grips with the realities of the ecologies. In other words, the bioregional constraints touted throughout this piece are an ecological reality for the species, regardless of if they choose to acknowledge it. The real economy asserts itself. Assuming that folks don't merely want to wait and live through a series of catastrophes to reach similar ends, that is, assuming the species makes a choice to continue itself by making some kind of active effort, there are several methods for the actual implementation of the first pass-through of the moneyless free labor system. This section will try to give some significant guidance as to how to do so. Before doing so, however, it's important to reaffirm the nominal initial aim. The first pass-through takes for granted initially, but not finally, the 40-hour work week per household, understood as a couple, generally speaking, nuancing that may be required, wherein each individual within a coupling has an expectation of 20 hours of work per week as a norm, with the couple themselves being able to determine the exact split of the work required. The rationale of this for the first pass-through is rather simple. It has already been tested as a norm, and the notion of a standard 40-hour work week is already the norm in society. Here we've merely divided the standard work week hours between the standard coupling per household. Moreover, such already accounts for the amount of existing labor in the system. In other words, the first pass-through of the system simply makes no changes, beyond those that are already outlined elsewhere as straightforward consequences of instituting the system. The moneyless free labor societies as a systemization, akin to a capitalistic modeling, holds that broadly the actions of freely chosen labor through iterations of the species, either generationally or via iteration of labor choice, does the labor of actualizing the system. There isn't, in other words, a dictum that is followed, so much as a plan that guides suggestive predictive aspects, certain ethical and educational norms of behavior, and relevant philosophical argumentation to push in the correct direction. Useful tools for the species to utilize, if they are wise enough to do so, in the stead of the broken tool of money. Laying out the proposal and presenting it to people, educating them regarding it, some degree of non-pointless, non-power-grabbing debates on the matter to suss out the relevant details, etc. All presents itself as a super tame, super simple, and very plausible methodology for implementation. This can occur within the public discourse, but also within the relevant political, academic, activist, labor and industry operati. Understanding that the notion of such head-nodding of agreement is not debating for the sake of debating, nor for that matter is it necessarily debating the merits of the system. Rather, it is discourse surrounding the hows, the pragmatics, the kinds of agreements between the relevant parties involved that takes place. All the various nuances and bioregional variation that needs to be addressed. This is a kind of top-down approach in at least some sense. It holds that there are people within the current who have the capacity to make these kinds of decisions, without any particularly massive upheaval involved in implementation. Utilization of these towards the implementation is among the more straightforward methodologies. There are a few aspects of this approach, as it differs relative to the role a current decision-maker has. For the politician in the current, among the central questions is to what degree is it necessary or good to redraw political borders along the grounds of bioregional maps. In a serious sense, such may entail politicians in the current to work together, noting that by and large such bioregionally predicated structures are within the purview of existing nation-states and their immediate neighbors. That is to say, that folks within any given nation in the current are largely just redrawing their own political borders, though likely with some negotiation with their immediate neighbors. Such likely does on its own entail a kind of seppuku on the part of the current political arrangements, at least on a national level. After all, the overarching notion is that political structures ought to be minimized in their scope of concern, and relegated to the most local level possible. The understanding therein being that by and large people are adult enough to manage things themselves, without the utilization of archaic political structures as means of control or direction. The relevance of noting that such political acts are largely dealing with themselves and their most immediate neighbors is that such doesn't amount to any kind of traditional political concerns regarding war. That is, it is not a suggestion of vying for political power. Rather, it is a suggestion of, again, political seppuku. The rewards for doing so are outlined throughout this piece, and in essence requires people to utilize their thinking caps to determine if the rewards are worth the sacrifice of the imaginary political borders they draw. The utilization of the bioregional map provides the relevant neutral framework. It is not derived from any sort of political concerns, and hence isn't really reducible to any kind of political concerns. Another major question for the current politic is how to remove money from the system without the entire system falling apart. Partly this is addressed in the other sections of Pragmatics of Implementation, though such doesn't really inform directly as to what, if any, role the politico may have within that process. It may be the case that in the current only the politicos and some academics have the relevant perspective regarding how overall trade is generally conducted. Technically, of course, that kind of information exists within each industry as it relates to that industry, but the point is that when it comes to the overall picture as to how trade is currently being conducted, we're largely speaking of the politicos and certain disciplines in the academics that are even bothering to pay attention to it. Hence, the question as to when are there enough agreements between the various industries, and when those agreements are approaching bioregionally constrained structures as outlined in this piece, such that they can reasonably forego the utilization of the tool of money may at least currently be determined via these peoples. Noting that they are not the only option available for such things. But insofar as the species may want to utilize this option, such may constitute a reasonable role for the politicos and the relevant academics. In a sense, the politicos and academics watch the activists, industry and labor operati to determine when there is enough agreement regarding trade relations to warrant the removal of money from the system. Likewise, they can play a role in orchestrating the relevant people towards the implementation. Perhaps among the best realistic methodologies is to simply ask oneself or someone else, would you actually do work in a moneyless free labor society? That is, would you do such voluntarily, without any particular external motivating factor? If you had the free time and resources available, would you do meaningful work, such as hobbies, crafts, and so forth? Would you do the labors that are essential? Would you agree to doing some set number of labor hours per week for a set number of years? Wherein your rewards for doing so are free access to all the goods and services available, and the rewards of helping others, meaningful labor, etc.? If the answer is yes, and if the answer is yes more generally, then there is a head nodding of agreement. If someone has an answer of no, they ought to have some reason or rationale as to why not. My strong suspicion is that virtually everyone would answer yes to this. Their only real rationale for answering no being a belief that others would somehow use, abuse, or otherwise do all the bad stuff to them. This amounts to a basic collective action problem. This piece tries to allay those sorts of fears through description of the rationale, motivational aspects, explanation of the processes, etc. But on a fundamentally human level, if you as the reader would be willing to do so, and if everyone or at least most everyone else would be willing to do so, there is no reason to suspect that such isn't a good indicator of its applicability. Try and understand that if the only reason folks would say no is that they believe that folks wouldn't do their fair share, such as a rationale disproves itself, that everyone would say yes, but for that fear, that emotion, entails that there is nothing there but the emotion. No one would say no for any other reason, hence, they would all say yes. That fear is, if not at least a root cause of recourse to the utilization of master's whip. On that point, it is worth recognizing the retirees, those people in the current who ostensibly do not have to work anymore. They nonetheless work at a wide variety of things. Why? Boredom, generosity, kindness. Likewise, people tend to want to do volunteer work as a preference, if given the choice, prefer to do meaningful work, and similarly much of the relevant labor in life that actually improves people's lives is done for free. For instance, all the various labors that occur in the home and via the various out-of-home activities. The point therein again is that people will work for doof. This is by far the gentlest methodology and dovetails with really boring head nodding of agreement. With the proposal being out there, there is pretty straightforward non-violent political pressure that can be put upon the existing political operati to implement it. Any sane people in this world would tend to agree with this proposal or something akin to it. Only those whose principal concerns are the maintaining of the existing political arrangements have any real reason to not want to do so, that is, they may be blinded by the power that politics grants them to make decisions for other people. That said, there is a great deal of tradition, especially in the Western world, and within the traditions of democracies that tend to hold towards the kinds of principles within this proposal. Among them being the traditions that hold towards a small government, personal liberty, freedom of labor, and freedom to trade. In any case, the point being that this does present itself as a possible avenue of implementation. The specifics on this method are not actually worth explaining, as folks in general are already familiar with them. The drawbacks of this approach are that it depends specifically upon those people least likely to benefit from it, at least in any sense of personal wealth or power, which is oft what these people are interested in. But I do want to temper that claim. I do not think that such people are necessarily terrible people. They oft have good intentions, are seeking to work within the moneyed system as it is, and doing the best they can. The ask, ultimately, to each of them, is to be the last of their kind, the last of the political folks who have as their concern moneyed interest, and in almost all cases, the last of their kind to be politically concerned with the world as it is drawn via the imaginary lines of politics. This methodology is the gentlest because it avoids pretty much all the looming catastrophes by adapting all the primary potential obstacles to that of primary doers of the relevant deeds that ought to be done. Hence, the ask from on high is to commit seppuku. Note that not all existing political bodies need get on board for this prior to its implementation by some existing political bodies. Nor for that matter need there necessarily be any particular agreements between any given set of existing political bodies in this regard. In the current there are large blocks of political bodies that could do so, that could push this, that is on an international level. But the implementation of the system needn't wait for them to do so. I'd suggest that the pushing of it on international and national levels is a good thing and would support the actual implementation of the system on a smaller, likely more relevant scalar. While there may be some limitations involved to its implementation on a smaller scalar, as in, perhaps some legal limitations relative to the national or international political/legal structure, overall the bulk of the system is actually primarily about local smaller scalar structures. The economics, the movements of goods and services, the reliance upon which regional entities, in other words, is the bulk of the systemization. Through implementation of those aspects, such provides the proper foundation for the larger scalar national and international existing political structures to redrawn their relevant boundaries predicated upon the bioregional structures. After all, as the other elements structure themselves accordingly, such already does much of the relevant work involved in the restructuring process. At the same time, the existing national and international political structures giving rhetorical support to the notion provides the proper political cover for the smaller scalar political and non-political organizations to implement it. Eventually these two scalars meet. This kind of agreement holds a bit more towards the active living of this modality insofar as such is possible within the existing system. It holds to many familiar ethical norms within especially the loosey leftist community, though also many that folks in the righty-tighty communities would recognize. By local first, where local entails as local as one can possibly get it. Compare to the notion of ethics of small towns, familial ethics, importance of mom and pop shops, etc. Live frugally. Do not buy things you don't need, while being reasonable about buying the things you may want or desire. Understand that everything you buy entails labor somewhere, and the aim is to reduce the labor required. Work minimally. A bit more than the notion of quiet quitting, the notion therein is to minimize the amount of work hours you really have to work. This dovetails with living frugally. Cook at home, make time for home life, make time for raising families, etc. Implementation of the 40-hour work week as a norm per household is very plausibly a choice people can make. As labor becomes more scarce, yes, various businesses may close, others will prosper a bit more, and yes, wages will tend to increase. This is basic labor economics within the current system. This aspect simply amounts to folks recognizing that, and recognizing that a glut of labor is currently in the market, as each individual in a typical couple is rather foolishly trying to live their life via work, career, etc. I want to distinguish that point from folks who hold something like a woman ought to be in the home. The issue isn't or ought not be particularly gendered. The issue is having two people per household trying to each work 40 hours a week. Is it really any wonder that there is a glut of labor, overproduction, and overconsumption as a result? Implementation of this particular reduction in the amount of hours worked is plausible simply as a matter of choice on the part of people. It may very well entail the other aspects, living frugally, shopping locally, etc., but such is doable, and in the longer term entails higher wages as demand for labor increases. Resisting that moneyed call and sticking to a 40-hour work week standard per household, or less if you can manage it, forces the economy to shift. Notable within that is the relative ease of doing so as a couple, hence some pragmatics to coupling up to achieve these kinds of goals. Not merely or only coupling up, also such things as tripling up, roommates, living with friends, and so forth. Noting that there is a relevant point here regarding doing so not merely because one is required to do so, but also because by doing so folks are thereby simply living the systemization as best they can, and thereby forcing the circumstances to come about. If one can afford, in other words, to live alone, or to live as a couple, etc., one ought still live as a coupling, or with more than merely a couple respectively, as by doing so one is thereby reducing the costs associated with living, with housing, with the various bills, and so forth. That in turn enables people to work fewer hours, as they have less expenses. Utilize one's free time in ways that are helpful towards the relevant ends. Go to local venues, for instance, as a means of doing something, rather than planning on further away kinds of trips. Volunteer more at places that make a meaningful difference in people's lives. Utilize your free time towards the raising of children, educating them, spending time with them, having fun with them, making sure that their lives are enjoyable rather than tedious and difficult. Learn how to repair one's own things, make them last longer, and so forth. Utilize the existing online markets to give away things for free rather than selling them. Here I am speaking of individuals, not businesses, as I don't think businesses can simply start giving things away without there being broader agreements and understandings in place. However, see the following section. Giving things away, rather than trying to sell them, undermines the existing economic structures, puts pressure on them to reduce their own prices, and fosters an important cultural aspect that is a part of moneyless free labor societies, the ethic of giving. If one has some kind of resource at their disposal, such as a home or a business, consider how best to utilize it towards helping others, rather than necessarily just making a buck. Shift the priorities, in other words, toward the ends of enabling people to also start simply living the reality. If you do own a business, for instance, consider ways to have folks work fewer hours without reducing their overall pay. Such may entail hiring more people, cutting business hours. Some business hours are not profitable anyways, right? Changing certain business practices to simplify the workload, shortening supply lines, and so forth. This is not intended as an exhaustive list. The point is that these are all things a business could actually do within the current moneyed system while still being successful as a business. And they are things that the laborers therein would likely be happy to help with doing. Have a conversation with your laborers about it, y'all. Similarly, if you are a business, start supplying as much of your materials as locally as possible. Speak to other business owners. I know y'all all know each other, winky face. Get them to do the same. Chances are good that the local supplier of material X would prefer to supply them to local vendor Y. If you own a home, opening your home to others is a surprisingly practical way of helping. That is, renting a room out and doing so for cheap. Not necessarily for free, but for cheap. Deliberately below market value, to be exactly blunt about it. Doing so enables someone to work less, have less stress in their life, pay off their debt, live more comfortably, etc. I want to stress that such can make a rather huge difference in someone's life, as housing costs are typically the biggest costs people have. Spread the word. Have you heard the good news yet? This is actually also potentially rather useful tbh. Now, none of these on their own actually do the most relevant of things, namely, the actual removal of money from the system, and the actual changing of the political borders to those of the bioregional constraints. But they do actualize parts of the systemization. Again, the aim therein is not to put pressure on the system to make the change, though doing so may in point of fact do just that. Rather, the aim is to actualize as much of the system as is possible, simply by living it insofar as such is realistically possible within the current system. While there may not be any formal bioregional constraints in place regarding trade, for instance, folks can still act as if there were, and thereby formally create the reality of at least that aspect of the systemization. There may not be a formal 40-hour work week per household, but folks can help create the conditions whereby that is the reality, realistically through simple agreements to do so. Similarly, regarding lowering the standard workweek times in businesses from the current of 40 to lesser amount. Each of these amount to similar ends, lessen the standard workweek across the board. A coupling, for instance, agreeing and aiming to exactly each work part-time and structuring their lives to be exactly like that, can actualize that. Albeit doing so can be difficult, entails real sacrifice on the part of people, but again, in the longer term, even speaking in the gross terms of monies, by doing so one does in fact push the system itself to adjust towards that reality. Moreover though, by doing so one actualizes that reality at least within one's own life, and at least insofar as such is possible, which is the main point of the public agreement section. Or a coupling or individual deliberately working fewer standard work week hours, advocating for businesses to make shorter work weeks, each can effectively help create those conditions, simply in virtue of the doing of the things. Living a kind of life whereby one's workweek is 30 hours entails, well, living that life in actuality and pushes the culture, businesses, and the economy to restructure itself in exactly that manner. Fewer workers over time does translate to higher pay. Less demand for goods does translate to lower prices. The most difficult part therein is that these changes do not happen immediately, and there are, shitheads out there who actively fight against it, 'cause they are quite literally completely insane, and fully believe that money is a real thing. There is the plausibility of a ground-up approach, though it will have significant limitations as it is working within the current system. This particular methodology provides for a sound footing, practical approach that isn't particularly dependent upon any overarching structure. Agreements between local businesses can functionally operate within the proviso that all the businesses are supplied locally. Folks with any common sense as to the current system can pretty easily get a sense as to why this approach has significant limitations, namely, that a lot of businesses specifically do not source locally, and hence there are additional hurdles to first get the businesses to supply locally, or as locally as possible. That can, however, be coupled together with the proposal of a moneyless free labor society in general. In other words, folks can say, hey, you should supply locally, and have the following style of agreement. The bread maker has an arrangement with the local wheat producer, the beer maker with the local barley, hops and wheat growers, The barber with all other businesses, that in essence, they keep producing and providing the things they are providing, and in exchange they can partake in the other goods and services within the local community. Everyone participates for the simple reason that they already know the metrics of how much labor is required, and the value of the various goods and services provided, and the rate of consumption of exactly those goods and services. No money is required, as no business needs to make an arrangement with anyone from outside the locale. Note that these kinds of arrangements needn't actually take effect unless and until some certain threshold of agreement is reached. The point being to develop the relevant trade and economic framework from the ground up via basic agreements, to the point that folks can see that everyone is actually willing to do this, and then to begin implementing it. Within the currents, this presents issues in regards to how a local business would be supplied with goods and services that are not within the relevant local bound. This is not necessarily a huge issue, it just begins to map out how the secondary and tertiary trade agreements are being structured. Bioregionally speaking, this problem is significantly mitigated, and hence, the rationale for bioregionally bound structures. Its mitigation comes from the fact that within a bioregion most relevant resources for day-to-day life can be had, such as basics and more than basics of food, shelter, play space, etc. The issues arise in part because many of the local businesses are not entirely or even mostly supplied from within the bioregion. Moreover, as noted elsewhere, it is not the case that we would necessarily want each bioregion exclusively deriving its goods and services from within the bioregion. The aim, after all, is to mitigate the necessity of especially interbioregional trade while still meeting all the needs, wants, and desires of any given bioregion as such. Technically, there is nothing that prevents such agreements, certainly not in the currents of the business/economic world. Free markets as they are, enable people to exactly enter into those kinds of agreements with each other. If each adjacent bioregion to a given bioregion also has these kinds of agreements regarding their supply and distribution of goods and services, the issue is further mitigated. Specifically, chances are very good that many of the goods and services that are not available within a given bioregion are currently being supplied by adjacent bioregions. Hence, basic agreements can be made between adjacent bioregions to keep up the supply lines as they are, with the understanding that by doing so each bioregion thereof is enabled to freely provide for those living within that bioregion with the current rate of goods and services. There will be a residue of goods and services that are not being provided for via either a given bioregion or those bioregions adjacent to them. But of course the exact same kind of reasoning via agreement can persist. All those other non-adjacent bioregions have the same kind of choice. The proposal isn't necessarily that this or that bioregion does this, but rather, that folks within every bioregion begin doing this. They know that if they want to continue to provide the goods and services they currently are, then they are better served by entering into similar kinds of agreements. Moreover, each bioregion is receiving the majority of its supplies not derived from itself via adjacent bioregions. Or, if they are not currently doing so, they and the overall structure would be better served if such were the case. Hence, there is within that an incentive and imperative to try and supply primarily within a given bioregion, secondarily via adjacent bioregions, and only tertiarily via any other non-adjacent bioregion. That kind of basic structure very likely provides for the goods and services of most things, for most people. Exceptions very likely being things that specifically are precision manufacturing, wherein it is likely better to have more centralized industrial processes providing those kinds of goods and services, or they are goods and services that are not realistically producible within the bioregion or its adjacent bioregions. In either of those cases, though, we are speaking of exactly the kinds of goods and services that are primarily provided via interbioregional trade. This methodology of focusing on local agreements, in other words, provides a kind of path forward for people, without necessarily being dependent upon the actions of governments or, for that matter, big corps. Though it is well worth noting and considering, especially for those folks working in and running the big corps, that these kinds of agreements work just as well for those sorts of businesses. The scalar differences may entail that there are some aspects that are going to tend towards tertiary trade structures, and that y'all may end up functionally structuring this with local governments. But nonetheless, the current reality of big corps is exactly that y'all can fairly freely structure agreements, aiming for as local as possible, and developing the relevant larger scalar business structural agreements for interbioregional and intrabioregional trade are important aspects to accomplish. In other words, Big Corp X making the same style of agreements with Big Corp Y as discussed in this section is of relevance and plausibility. There is nothing that makes such agreements illegal, in other words. In Pragmatics, these kinds of agreements of all scalars likely ought to be made to such an extent that they cover sufficient bioregions to make them not dependent upon the use of money. Such entails a point of critical mass of agreement. As to the plausibility of such things, although I am not endorsing cryptocurrency, something that it has demonstrated and reminded people of is that trade is literally just an agreement between people. If, in other words, all these kinds of agreements were made by which trade was occurring via some fiat currency the locales agreed upon using instead of some other fiat currency, everyone would nod their heads. The proper lesson to learn from that is the utter bullshit that money actually is. People, and indeed the species, can simply agree without being dependent upon any kind of currency or medium of exchange, beyond trust. To detail that a bit, historically speaking, the methodology that digital currencies used was pretty much exactly the methodology being described here, making arrangements with a variety of businesses such that they would accept digital currency in exchange for whatever goods or services they were providing. Once a critical mass of businesses and individuals had accepted digital currency as a means of trade, digital currency became a valid system of transaction. Pretty seashells. Such entails a recent history of pretty much exactly how currency is functionally created, which in turn, again, reminds us as to what the underpinnings are of any given monetary system. There are no reasons as to why folks couldn't forego the pretty seashells, make the same kind of arrangements, with the understanding and trust that what is being provided is free access to all goods and services. And as regards theft, thievery, etc., as noted earlier, and really commonsensically, if all the goods and services are free, why would people steal? And regarding criminality more generally, if folks are all being well tended to, many of the causes that underpin criminal activity would go away. I want to briefly consider and discard the notion that folks could utilize a fiat currency of some kind, or any other sort of currency for that matter, while also doing these kinds of free labor exchange of agreements. The notion therein is, not unlike the aforementioned cryptocurrencies, folks can have one set of agreements with some folks, and another set of agreements with other peoples. Likely, given the bioregional constraints in the system, having a free labor exchange with locals, and a moneyed exchange with non-locals, whereby a local is understood as bioregionally bound. This could take really only a few differing forms within the bioregionally constrained system. Free labor exchanges within any given bioregion, currency exchanges outside that bioregion, or free labor exchanges within any given set of bioregions, and currency exchanges outside that set of bioregions, or inversely, currency exchanges within any given bioregion or any given set of bioregions, local currencies, and free labor exchanges occurring outside of those bounds. In any of these cases, we ought realistically expect the same kinds of issues to arise as we see in any moneyed systemization whatsoever. Here, though, we are likely going to see, in theory that is, what earlier manifestations of moneyed systems might have actually looked like. That is, certain sets of people utilizing moneyed systems, while others do not. Historically, this would have been the aristocracies and the wealthy in a given society. That is, those groups would have generally utilized moneyed systemizations, whereas everyone else wouldn't have. That kind of delineation actually has some kinds of boons to it, namely, that it leaves the issues of trade within the purview of a few rather than as an en masse kind of proposition, thereby significantly delimiting the harms associated with such kinds of transactions. That said, there are also some pretty well understood pitfalls therein, like massive inequalities in the distributions of wealth, wars being fought over resources and merely for the acquisition of wealth, the acquiring that is of pretty seashells to trade, and so on. Still, I want to consider the point a bit more, just that it be out here on the page, so to speak. The possibility is suggested that a given bioregion utilizes free labor exchange, but still performatively exchanges monies, so that those monies can be used to exchange with folks not from within the bioregion. To give this as positive a spin on it as I can, let's suppose that such was an interim systemization, a hybrid systemization. The plausible benefits of it being something like the following. Suppose that a given bioregion comes to make free labor exchange agreements, but alas, some other bioregions haven't, at least not yet. Moreover, the bioregions that have made such agreements still trade with those bioregions that have not. What are they to do? Those other bioregions are of course happy to take the goods and services of the bioregion that exchanges them, without utilization of monies, but those bioregions that still utilize monies only offer up the pretty seashells, rather delusionally thinking that they are valuable. 'Cause let's be honest, they would be delusional in their thinking of such things. In such circumstances, what folks to do? Simply not trade with them? Exchange things via gross bartering methods, as in, you got some wood for sheep? Do we take their pretty seashells knowing that they value them, and then we can exchange those back to them for actually valuable things? Such is at least plausibly done. After all, the cryptocurrencies also teach us that. Folks not utilizing cryptocurrencies still trade, and such amounts to differing economic systems interacting. Which ought to give at least some kind of clue as to the various issues involved with such practices. Issues though there may be, and let's go so far as to suppose the following. We are still aiming towards a moneyless free labor society in total, so we are aiming to avoid exactly those issues. Nonetheless, along the way we find ourselves in the position whereby some bioregions, some peoples even, are on board. They make the agreements with each other, they know the secret handshake and give the seductive wink and nod to each other. Still, there are others who are not so inclined. Again, in such circumstances, what exactly ought we to do? Such seems likely to be the case at least at some point in the process of doing the labor of implementing this systemization. Suppose a bad case whereby some bioregion or set of bioregions stubbornly hangs on to monies for a decade longer than other adjacent bioregions or non-adjacent bioregions. What then? Perhaps if the aim remains to include them within the moneyless free labor societies, the best course of action is to ignore the pretty seashells and still give them the goods and services they need, want and desire, providing that such maintains all the other relevant metrics of the system, the renewal rates, shorter supply lines, etc. Here the notion is perhaps being motivated from the same sense of fear that motivates most moneyed concerns. Are they taking advantage of us? Taking advantage of our generosity? Assuming the free labor bioregions are maintaining their work-week goals, staying within the renewal rates, and so forth, there isn't any reason why goods and services wouldn't also be given freely to folks that are still utilizing monies. Perhaps they would find it strange, perhaps they would look at us queerly, but then, who doesn't enjoy a queer-eyed gaze once in a while? Perhaps they would attempt to put pretty seashells in our hands, and perhaps we simply refuse it. We're willing to give, but not willing to loan. If we have excess, and we are quite generous, industrious, hard-working, then we would gladly give such away to them, exactly as we would towards those who are also doing a free labor system. The aim therein is to demonstrate and indeed to create the reality of the system. Out of hypothesis, such folks are already not the highest priority, not in virtue of their utilization of monies, but rather in virtue of their status as constituting interbioregional trade anyway. Such methodologies imply that once a bioregion begins doing this, once critical mass is reached within a bioregion, that bioregion's capacity to actually do the thing is already present, and hence they can actually do the thing without recourse to the utilization of monies even with adjacent bioregions. This is true regardless of the scalar we are speaking of. If we are speaking of, for instance, smaller scalar communities, locales that exist within any given bioregion, they too can reach a critical mass of agreement. A township, perhaps a county, or a subsection of a watershed, etc. What's important therein is that the region be large enough to provide for a critical mass of goods and services, such that they are able to produce and provide a sufficient amount of the needs, wants and desires of the people living within it. Once that critical mass is reached, a local economy can be formed. They may trade with folks outside of that region, and do so via the same free labor sorts of agreements, without fear or concern of being taken advantage of, so long as they remain within all the other relevant metrics of concern. Their concern, after all, is to maintain the resource renewal rates, relatively light workload, familial forms, general quality of living and so forth, not to make money as such. They've simply decoupled those kinds of concepts from the concept of moneyed concerns. Providing that gifting their surplus supplies to folks outside the region of concern maintains those aspects, there is no harm whatsoever in doing so. Indeed, from their perspective, there is great good in doing so. It means being able to provide for the well-being of others, to enable others to live better, and to, in the longer term, enable those other regions to follow suit and likewise adopt the free labor systemization to give up the older tool. Perhaps the concern is less fear-motivated and more pragmatically motivated, As in, what if it's the case that some folks within a given region or bioregion are opposed to the systemization in a democratic sense? Do we simply ignore them? Short answer, yes. Democratic systems do not tend to imply aspects of control of the monetary systemizations. That is, the role of a democratic systemization in general is not to directly control the economic systemizations via the politic, even democratic politics. Hence, there isn't a democratic or political dimension to this systemization, at least, not in the sense being suggested in this section. This section is rather specifically providing a means whereby the political dimensions can be avoided and ignored. I want to try and be as clear as I can on this point. If we were discussing how to implement this systemization via the means of politics, then it would follow that there is a significant pragmatic concern regarding what to do if part of the electorate was opposed to it. However, in this section rather specifically we are directly providing a means of implementation that is not political in its form. It doesn't, in other words, purport to be itself trying to engage in the political process to make or force its implementation. The concern may be that even though there isn't a political dimension to this section, and folks go about doing these kinds of things, there are some other folks who attempt to stop it via political means. And hence, what do we do in that instance? I thereby refer to the sections regarding the political processes. In short, you fight them in the arena of politics, and also, super critically important, do it anyway. Just because they may be trying to do so, doesn't actually mean that they have done so or have the right to do so. Don't just lay down and take it like a bottom winky face. As just alluded to, in most especially democratic political circumstances, the notion that the government would have a say in the matter is mute. They are not in general the right kind of entities to implement, but rather, the right kind of entities to restrain. They are, in other words, oversight. A vital role to be sure. But here, in answer to the direct question, the direct answer is, do it first, be the top, the initiator, not the bottom, the receiver, in the relationship. This concern may also be referring to less politicized aspects, despite its political overture. Namely, perhaps there are people in a local community that are unconvinced. They aren't clamoring about it via the politics, they aren't trying to block others from doing it, they just refuse to participate. In which case I would refer to the same kind of points regarding both cryptocurrencies and dealing with other bioregions. Kindness. Gift-giving. Continue to deal with them, variously depending on the exact circumstances, as either persons to whom you want to continue to gift-give and maintain your existing gift-giving structure, refusing their money. Or, if you're still building to critical mass to develop the gift-giving structure, speak to others aside from them. Work with whom you can, without prejudice, returning to these folks when you have more people already on board to try again. Patience, persistence, love, and kindness. Stubbornly murderous kindness. The concern may also be stemming from a pragmatic concern that some folks beyond the region are providing relevant goods and services to the region, bioregion, or other scalar of concern, and they are utilizing monies whereas we are not. For instance, perhaps the wood the region uses is coming from a corp that insists upon taking monies in exchange for the woods they got. The region doesn't have access to the wood sands via this corp, hence the corp can force the issue of monies. Partly this is answerable in the following way: a critical mass hasn't yet been reached. The concern, in other words, is better phrased as, how do we reach critical mass rather than, what about this situation that may arise after we've reached critical mass? Still, the concern is valid, noting here that this is something that cryptocurrencies faced in a similar, though not exactly the same, manner. Cryptocurrencies faced it similarly in that they had to reach critical mass before their currencies were more widely accepted. It's different in that they were not ostensibly the only means of currency being used. That is, they understood themselves as just one more currency in a market predicated upon imaginary things, rather than a market that seeks to disregard the imaginary monies in favor of utilization of the real. For cryptocurrencies, they could rather straightforwardly answer this particular question with the following: pay them the monies they accept, and use those monies to pay for other kinds of goods and services, or, perhaps, use those monies to buy up more cryptocurrencies. Either way, the would be received, and they could continue to functionally operate without having reached critical mass. Again, this is partially already answered as simply noting that the agreements can persist even if critical mass hasn't yet been reached. The agreement is a wink and nod, a smile, and an understanding that once critical mass is reached, then the foregoing of the utilization of the old tool of money is warranted. Until then, monies are still exchanged, as was already explained. If the question is even more pragmatic, as in, how do we convince Corp X, the answer is something akin to this piece here, y'all. We discuss it with them. Discuss it with your neighbors, friends, put it in the public discourse, approach labor unions, and so forth. There is leg and mouth work involved in the process. Don't be a piece of poo, talk about it. I suspect what is motivating this kind of concern, and hence too what folks would likely face in resistance from people as they do this kind of relevant labor, is the profound confusion that money is a real thing, rather than merely a symbolic representation of agreements. There are agreements, and there are the symbolic representations of those agreements. There isn't also this other thing called money. If that isn't completely clear, consider it this way. The Moneyless Free Labor Society utilizes the following currencies: a wink and a nod, a smile and a handshake, a hello, a hug, a kiss and some love. How you doing, winky face? Now, to folks using a different currency, that may seem odd, but then, they are faced with the exact same question being posed here as problem. Do we accept their currency? Do we play along? Do we perform the game with them? Do we wink, nod, smile, hug, kiss and love, just to give a how you doing in exchange? What the fuck we gonna do with all these pretty seashells anyway? There is a degree by which the diminishment of the population provides for this kind of system. It is arguable that the current system has as one of its boons the growth of the human species. In other words, the industrialization and capitalistic processes exactly provide for ever greater productive capacities, within which the species lives. However, these processes do not exist with meaningful constraints relative to the bioregions, and hence they tend to level off at some point, in addition to, of course, all the other horrors they cause. But herein the point is a bit more that the species' productive capacities haven't really changed. They are still highly efficiently productive, but the populations they are going to be providing for in the future will be shrinking. Hence, the productive capacities enable for a relative ease of providing for the people. Without going too far into the techno-fantasy land, There is something very meaningful to be said regarding the capacities of industry, techniques, technology, etc., to do labor that would require a much larger population without it. This surplus of labor is actually a problem within the current system, wherein people are required to work to live. Society is required to create superfluous labor in order to provide jobs, etc. In any case, the reduction in population relative to the species' productive capacities entails a further growing surplus of goods and services. It isn't, in other words, as if we need all these people to grow all the foodstuffs, for instance. The required labor to do so is tiny. So we can in principle maintain the species' output of food without necessarily diminishing our consumption of it. Likewise for housing, the species' capacity to build houses doesn't diminish with a reduction in the population. Moreover, the inevitable surplus of housing that arises from the diminishment of the population provides homes for people. Similar is essentially true across the board for goods and services. Note this aspect of the reality of implementation in some sense is inevitable, and hence dovetails with the inevitability means of implementation. Such ought to be encouraged, as it is not a bad or terrible sort of thing in any way, shape, or form, but will bottom out at some point. If, that is, folks want to continue the species, reproduction of the species has to occur. Also note that such doesn't and likely ought not entail people in general choosing not to have any babies, but rather people choosing to have fewer babies. Too many of those people who are themselves wonderful choose to not have the babies, much to the detriment of life. Insofar as such is done as a choice, which imho is the only ethically reasonable modality of doing such things, such also dovetails well with Section 14d, Public Agreement, as it is a methodology of living that functionally operates well to just start living the reality of a moneyless free labor society, as a means whereby folks thereby create the reality of a moneyless free labor society. See also Section 14n, Pragmatics of Life. It's unclear to what degree this will actually take place, and to what degree that it will have these kinds of effects. However, that trend is happening, and insofar as it does happen, it also facilitates the moneyless free labor society, and is also a detriment to a work-to-live society, and therefore to most and perhaps all moneyed societies. Thus, such ought to be encouraged. Reallocation of control of a given resource. Specifically, we are referring to the reality of international corporations and governments that control resources across numerous bioregions. In the currents of moneyed societies, reallocation of control entails allocating the control of the resource to a given bioregion, typically as a matter of government control, which, to be super clear on that, is not generally technically reallocation of control of the resource to the bioregion, but rather to some other interbioregional body, typically governments. Governments are not synonymous with bioregions, either in meaning or in practice. Certainly not in the current. When this is done within a moneyed system, there is actually very little change involved. The government takes control, they are still incentivized to sell the resource, those with wealth tend to be those who can afford it, and so how the resource is distributed doesn't generally change that much. What ostensibly is accomplished is that the wealth generated by the resource is moved to the government, and ostensibly to the local people. Within a moneyless system, on the first pass-through, It is likely also going to be the case that reallocation will not tend to meaningfully impact who is getting products and services. The first pass-through doesn't argue for any particular fiat changes to the existing system, and overall the moneyless free labor societies isn't arguing that control of the resources be meaningfully shifted, so much as the structures by which utilization of the resources be restructured. Granting that by and large the whole system minimizes the use of these internationally traded resources, and more generally minimizes the use of all resources to within the limit of renewal rate of each and every resource, and as noted the reduction of labor will entail a rather dramatic reduction in the overall usage of resources in general. Still, we would expect that the percentage of allocation of resources would nominally remain the same during the first pass-through. The basic ethical rationale for this are at least twofold. Firstfold. As it stands, most and perhaps all bioregions are at least in part dependent upon other bioregions via interbioregional trade. To simply grab at the resources and radically reallocate them would cause massive suffering all over the place. Resource wars, as the various bioregions scramble to sustain themselves, war over resources is almost inevitable if, that is, the basic systems in place are not initially maintained. Such, however, is not to suggest that the allocations of resources would or ought to remain the same. Developing each bioregion towards its own primarily self-sufficient status will entail reallocation of resources. Perhaps among the critical things to note is that such doesn't look like what that term means in the currents of moneyed societies. Specifically, reallocation doesn't really mean governments taking control and shifting the resources, goods and services to others, nor, for that matter, does it entail some differing Corp Y taking control of the resources from Corp X. Again, it is a reallocation predicated upon differing non-moneyed concerns, specifically, the concerns of freely chosen labor and the concerns of bioregional constraints. In Pragmatics, with the first pass-through, wherein money is not a meaningful concern, all labor within a bioregion that is not producing the various needs, wants and desires of life very likely pretty radically diminishes. Understanding that such does not impact the availability of exactly those needs, wants and desires of life. What is removed is the surplus labor and consequently surplus goods and services. All the needs, wants and desires of life are still entirely available in similar quantities as before within each bioregion. As noted and demonstrated via the pandemic, what we would refer to as essential labor is largely mapped out for us. That kind of diminishment of the amount of labor in the system is more or less what we would expect within a moneyless free labor system. This point is fairly crucial for folks to grasp onto. The shutdown of the world via the pandemic is a good indication of what initially but not necessarily finally a moneyless free labor society would look like, would go through, on its first pass-through. If we remove the concerns of money from the system, what we get are other concerns that come to the fore, such as not dying, as was the case with the pandemic. The priorities shifted, and folks acted upon those other kinds of concerns. While such actions did utilize the tool of monies, and hence the generalized case consideration that was the pandemic doesn't model a moneyless free labor society exactly, nonetheless it is a crucial kind of test case for consideration. Sans the distortions of moneyed concerns, the circumstances would have been different, some aspects would have gone smoother, some fearful realities and some imaginary fears of concerns would have been avoided, but regardless, the base essential workload would have been strikingly similar. Hence, the claim here that in a first pass-through, as we reallocate the workload, and hence therefore to reallocate the resource used towards the restraints of bioregional concerns, shortened supply lines, etc., via the removal of money as a concern, we would arrive at more or less exactly the state of workload that occurred via the pandemic. Perhaps just as importantly, such proves the viability of the moneyless free labor societies as a systemization, for there is in point of fact a generalized worldwide case consideration in which exactly that happened. Moneyless free labor societies, sans the life or death motivational forces involved winky face. Within each bioregion that freed up labor can thereby be utilized to improve the self-sustainability of each given bioregion by the building of the necessary infrastructure required to primarily supply the bioregion, secondarily supply adjacent bioregions, and tertiarily supply non-adjacent bioregions. It is via that labor that the reallocation of resources begins to take shape, as it becomes apparent what each bioregion ought to be laboring for in order to achieve basic self-sustainability of the bioregion's needs, wants, and desires. They would draw from the existing resources that are currently being allocated elsewhere. In terms of the pragmatics of the labor involved in doing so, interestingly enough, the international corporations have the relevant know-how, information, etc., to exactly reallocate resources towards these purposes. Absent any wealth-generating motivation, the international corporations become far less concerned with finding ways to extract more resources to sell, and far more concerned with managing the resources within the relevant renewal rates, and in all honesty can simply be tasked with the job of reallocating those resources towards the development of various bioregions. Tasked by whom? I mean, in some sense tasked by themselves via the hands of labor, in some sense tasked via this piece here, as in, this piece here makes the tasks clear, grants the asks that they may be wise enough to task themselves with the asks, and thereby do the relevant things. We may also hold that they could be tasked via the governing bodies to do the things. Such isn't particularly unheard of, nor for that matter, is such particularly infringing upon their capacity of control. Directing big Corp X or little shop Y towards some generalized aim is not the same as seizing the control of resources, or directly transferring or reallocating the means of production, etc. Arguably, such is exactly a meaningful aspect of what government of any sort means, and here we would be speaking of democratic processes in general, and ultimately with an aim towards localizing those government processes as much as possible. Sometimes philosophy takes control and takes to task the asks that are relevant. Among the important things to note about that is that the initial reduction of labor across the board entails a rather dramatic reduction in the usage of all resources. Hence, we would expect that there would be a rather radical increase in available resources to be used towards the relevant tasks of ensuring the primary self-sufficiency of each and every bioregion. To be a bit blunt, if we are no longer shipping pointless baubles around the world, if labor is not required to earn money to live, if the focus shifts so radically, all the various issues with fossil fuels, overconsumption, etc., largely though not completely go away, which entails a rather massive surplus of all those resources. Again, this is just in regards to the first pass-through of the moneyless free labor society. The reallocation of those surplus resources doesn't entail anything like selling them to the bioregions. Rather, such is something far more akin to a technical problem, as in how to fairly or at least reasonably reallocate those resources. Recalling that the surplus of resources is not yet even being generated by any particular reduction in the quality of lives of people in the wealthy bioregions. Which is to say, that there may be a loss in terms of pretty baubles shipped from far distant lands, but then again, pretty much all those can be produced locally via the increase in hobbies and various entrepreneurial activities. Beyond the pretty baubles point, in regards to production of goods and services in general, the current locating of such productions within far distant bioregions shifts to the production of those goods and services locally. Hence the points regarding cottage and bioregionally relevant industries. Moreover, it isn't the case that the surplus of labor, resources, goods and services is occurring only in, shall we say, poor bioregions. All those surpluses would occur within every bioregion on Earth simply in virtue of the first pass-through of the moneyless free labor society. In other words, in most bioregions, there will likely be some exceptions. The surpluses of labor and resource availability will be pretty significant. To point out one aspect of relevant pertinence, there isn't really a housing shortage pretty much anywhere on the planet. There is a shortage of housing availability due to price, and there is a boom in the desire to build housing in large and mega cities as they are the centers of wealth. But technically most people in every bioregion have some kind of home. The homeless population is small in most places. Moreover, there are massive surpluses of housing in places all around the developed world, wherein the desirability to live in the location has diminished. Again though, that desirability is largely about access to jobs, which is to say that these massive surpluses have pretty much everything to do with a moneyed system. And the drain of resources towards large and mega cities ironically places that huge numbers of people don't really want to live, but are effectively forced to do to the moneyed system. In other words, simply removing the money, basically giving away those surplus houses, which relevantly are generally closer to the relevant food sources than the large and mega cities are, goes a long way towards dealing with a great deal of the issues we are facing. All in essence for the sacrifice of money, simply in virtue of giving up the illusory value of money, wealth, etc. Perhaps a bit less inflammatorily put, all for setting aside the tool of money for the better tool of labor, and data of measurements regarding actual supply and demands. Hence, we may well suppose that a large portion of the surplus labor in the large and mega cities would choose to move, and moreover can be enticed to move, and I mean realistically, though not my personal fave, forced to move in those places where such practices are unfortunately the norm, into those depopulated bioregions. Again, absent any particular incentive for wealth generation, all the incentives of these people are more or less to live in areas of greater comfort, which, let's be honest, is not generally the large and mega cities. Given the massive size of the populations around the globe, we ought expect the creation of small towns and cities within these various locations. What we ought not expect is the unrestrained growth of those places, as their incentives are towards primarily supplying the bioregion they are within, secondarily supplying adjacent bioregions, and tertiarily supplying non-adjacent bioregions. Exceptions therein regarding unequal distribution of globally communal resources, see sections regarding intra/interbioregional trade, as well as this section. The main thirst of this somewhat modest section is to point out what ought to be the obvious. The pandemic was a generalized case consideration of relevance for a moneyless free labor society systemization on a global scale. The proof of it as actualizable via really the removal of monies as a serious consideration of concern. Rather than attempt to denote all the relevant points in writing here, the reality of those circumstances ought to be referenced. Notable within that generalized case consideration is that wheresoever moneyed concerns persisted, so too did the species' response to the situation tend to fail. During the global pandemic, moneyed concerns were in conflict, not in coordination with the concerns of people, and not of the productive sort of playful competition. Folks really ought take that to heart. When it came down to it, the concerns for money outweighed the concerns of people. As if the concerns of money were something entirely different than the concerns of people. Among the proofs thereof is that the moneyed systemization, even in life and death considerations, tends towards the wrong kinds of solutions. Money, 'tis an old and mangled kind of tool for a bygone age of kings and queens whose concerns were expressly not of money. To them, to the aristocracies, recall, monies was but a crude and fairly cruelly blunt tool to be avoided. Wherein money as such is not a limiting factor, wherein there is a massive surplus of labor, and wherein there is a massive surplus of resources, the capacity for the species to create ecologically sound multi-bioregional industries is not only a realistic aim, but an aim that isn't even particularly difficult to achieve. In terms of resource use, the buildings and factories utilize a vanishingly small amount, so little as to not be of any real concern in and of themselves. This regardless of the bioregion, granting that some resources will come from other bioregions for the construction, and the specialized skills necessary to do so may not be available in any given bioregion. Regardless, the usage of resources to accomplish that remains tiny. It is the en masse production of things and the en masse consumption of things wherein the usage of resources becomes overusage. These kinds of ecologically sound industries do not have as their aim the en masse production to supply all bioregions. This is among the key differences from the current system. Rather, primarily they are designed to utilize the bioregional resources most locally available to supply the needs, wants and desires of, again, primarily the bioregion they are in, secondarily the adjacent bioregions, and tertiarily non-adjacent bioregions. Hence, their ecological impact within the bioregion is minimized, both in terms of utilization of local resources, and in terms of pollution. Moreover, the species' technology to accomplish a reduction in pollution and minimization of the usage of resources has greatly improved. What exactly that means as a matter of definition of bioregion is primarily determined via the ecological sciences. It is not the case as it was centuries ago, wherein the various relevant crops were primarily located within their bioregions of origins. Each bioregion, and perhaps a bit more realistically, each set of adjacent bioregions generally has the capacity to grow a wide variety of non-native crops, while giving preference towards native crops to the bioregion, within the limits of ecological soundness and within the limits of supplying the set of adjacent bioregions with their needs, wants and desires. So, crops useful for the production of clothes are generally growable within any given set of adjacent bioregions. Perhaps not all varieties of crops useful for production of clothes, but there will be at least some set of such crops that are useful. Again, such is not to suggest that no other, in this case, clothes are available within any given set of adjacent bioregions. It is rather to suggest that those are the relevant products to primarily supply that set of adjacent bioregions, insofar as such is possible, and moreover, insofar as such isn't possible, such defines the relevant role of interbioregional trade. Each set of bioregions is far more than capable of providing for their relevant populations within this limit, e.g., we easily have the capacity to produce far more of such clothing or any other good or service within any given set of adjacent bioregions than the population therein really needs, wants, or desires. That capacity for surplus can be given away to non-adjacent bioregions, noting that as each set of bioregions is capable of doing this, the demand from non-adjacent bioregions is minimized. Wherein it is understood that the aim is to meet the supply needs for the demand needs, wants, and desires, not necessarily to be the supplier of those needs, but rather simply to have them met. Hemp, cotton, or silk, for instance, are growable in many different locations around the world. There is little sense in concentrating their production only to ship them around the world. In places where such crops are not growable, for the majority of them some adjacent bioregion is exactly capable of growing them. For the remainder, the giving away of the surpluses to supply them freely is no big deal. Again, within the limits of the renewal rates of the resources. The point of this, also fairly modest section, is to note that the technological development hasn't stagnated. It would be trivial, and trivially unimportant, to attempt to delineate all the various aspects thereof here. The kings and queens of old and new, the aristocracies, the elites, those folks in the currents that really ought to be considering these kinds of things, as they gaze oh so queerly upon the world as it is, they do well to consider this. The tools have changed. The technology is markedly different. The capacity to remake the world with it is vastly different. In the currents, monies as a concern is actually standing in the way of doing so. The adoption of new technologies, new methodologies, and the proper utilization of those tools demands a setting aside of the old ones. To quote the poets, money doesn't talk, it slanders.
Siêu Bao Jàng